Hey X, I've got a story for you. It is the most stressful call I've ever had to undertake as a 911 dispatcher, and something that keeps me up at night. Be me, 911 dispatcher for around 10 years. My job is a blur of panic and stress. It's not easy, and most who work the job have to have an active therapist of some kind and get checked out regularly to be sure that we are able to handle the stresses of the job. Sometimes, there is a lot of waiting involved if the night is quiet. It's usually routine stuff most of the time. Traffic accidents, noise complaints, drunken brawls and disagreements, sometimes a domestic dispute. Some days though, we get some really horrific call-outs, the kind of stuff that does not leave you for the rest of your life. The whole reason therapy is mandatory. Sometimes they make you question if you're really, truly aware of what goes on under our noses. This one happened to me a couple of months ago now. It's one that I have thought about every day since. It's one that just haunts me, and it probably will for the rest of my life. It was around 2 in the morning when the call came in. I was not prepared at first. Just thought it was going to be another drunken man dialing in about a fight or some silly dispute, as that was all we had had all night. The day had been quiet up until this point, and all of the calls we had gotten were not worth police time. The voice that came through was fear, pure fear. It was a woman's voice on the phone, breathless, clearly panicking. She gasped and managed to let out a soft please. Someone is in my house and I think they're trying to kill me or kidnap me or I don't know. I tried to reassure her and tried to get her to stay calm. I asked for her location immediately so that I could send some officers down ASAP to make sure that she was safe. I had my fingers ready to type the address into the system as soon as she told me. Her voice was shaky and she was clearly trying to keep it to a whisper. She must have been hiding somewhere in her house from the intruder. I don't know, they're in my house somewhere. They're really close, looking for me. I can't move or they will find me. I kept my composure and pressed her for more details again so that I could help her. I asked her exact location in the house, which room, etc. I asked if she was sure a person had broken in, or if they were outside, or if it could be something else. I asked if she could be sure something was moving. Many of you will think that these questions are pointless and that I am wasting time. That is the opposite of the truth. The second that call comes in, the officers are on their way. From then on, my job is to gather as much information as I can, while also trying to act as a calming presence for the person on the phone. I see all too many times people saying 911 operators are useless for this, but it has its purpose. I need to keep her mind focused and hopeful. She responded back in a whisper again. I don't really know. Oh God, I think I just heard them move. I think they're in the living room right now. I'm hiding in the closet in the master bedroom upstairs. Please, send someone right now, please. I could hear her breathing really loudly down the microphone, fast and erratic. Then I could hear a loud thump. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor. Then I heard her scream. It was a short scream, high-pitched. It was cut off though. Then there was nothing but silence, static. I tried desperately to get her to respond back to me, asking, "Ma'am, can you hear me? Are you okay?" I tried to reach her, but I couldn't. I hit the call back button to see if I could get her back on the line. Nothing at all. No response. The phone kept ringing, but no answer at all. It eventually rang out. I tried one more time, but was met with the same result. Something was not right here. I feared the worst. That the intruder she said she had heard breaking in downstairs had snatched her and done God knows what. The officers were en route, going as fast as they possibly could. The place was on the furthest end of the city, and with a city with traffic as bad as the one I work in, getting there was going to still take a bit. While they were on their way, I decided to check the caller ID of the phone to see if I could get any more information. The woman's number was a local number, but looking deeper into it, something really did not add up. The call log was showing that the number had no information attached to it at all. No name, no account information, no location data, completely untraceable. I could not be completely sure, but it seemed like a call from a burner phone. Why would she have one of those, and why would she use it to dial 911? I gave the responding officers a heads up, and also mentioned it to the lead dispatcher, who made a note of it. I was going to call back and make one more attempt to reach the woman. Before I could, the system flashed a new incoming call that I needed to answer. It was the same number as before, same area code and everything. It must have been the same woman. Seeing it gave a slight relief that at least she was still in a position to call us. I answered immediately and was prepared to burst into questions and to check if she was okay. I did not even have a chance to though. I heard a voice. It was not the same woman calling for help. It was a man's voice. I could hear him grinning while he talked. He just said, "How can I help you today?" I asked where the woman was, who he was, and what he had done to her. His voice was really calm. There was no adrenaline at all. I asked again, "Who am I speaking to?" I only heard breathing. Again, I clued in the lead dispatcher to inform the responding officers of the situation, while I tried my best to keep this man on the line. Still no response, so I double-checked the number, and sure enough, I was not mistaken. Same phone as before. After some static and another slight pause, the man spoke again. He whispered into the receiver, "Please help me," but like in a higher pitch, almost like he was trying to mimic the woman from earlier, like he was mocking us. I asked what he meant and tried not to show any fear when talking. He just responded, "She is gone. You can't help her anymore." I tried to keep him talking, asking all sorts of questions, but he would not divulge much. He wouldn't say his name, but then he started talking again. "We own her. She escaped, and we simply came here to reclaim our property." There must have been multiple intruders or assailants on the scene. Vital information. It's too late. She tried to use her silly little burner phone, thinking she would be safe. Again, he ignored my question, but spoke back to me one more time. "Who I am doesn't matter. Whether you knew my name or not, it would not matter." And then he hung up before I could speak again. The police arrived on the scene shortly after the call, maybe after a minute or two after it ended. When they arrived at the woman's house, they found pretty much nothing. Nothing they could identify the kidnappers with anyway. The house was a complete mess. A shattered lamp, some overturned furniture. The woman clearly tried to go out fighting. No traces of blood on the scene was probably the only positive to take away from this call. What was weird is that every door and window in the house was locked and showed no signs at all of any kind of forced entry. Whoever it was either had been let in, or they had another way to get in. That is not the only strange part. I always check things multiple times over, 2 or 3 just to be sure, like an impulse that I have that I always have to do, no matter what. That call did not show up on the system after that day. No trace of the call at all, like anywhere, like it had been wiped completely from the system. I brought it up to lead dispatch, same person who was on the shift that day. They told me it must just be a glitch in the system and that they would have it looked into. I pressed them a little harder. A glitch like that would be catastrophic and not something to so easily dismiss. They just told me to drop it and get on with my shift. They were in a foul mood with me for the rest of the day. I have no idea what happened next. No idea what the guy on the phone was talking about, why the call disappeared from the system, or why lead dispatch was just so twitchy about it. I have no idea what happened to the woman either. There have been no follow-ups at all since that day. The case remains open, obviously, but there has been very little in the way of evidence or answers. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. If you do and you want to hear more, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment down below, as it lets the algorithm know that you like my content and it promotes it to more people. My goal for the channel is to hit 50,000 subscribers, and we're closing in fast, so thank you, and back to the stories. Good evening, X. While browsing the archives, I came across a thread about unusual experiences while working in a hospice. I was reminded of several incidents that occurred when I was working as a nursing assistant at an old folks' home in Pittsburgh, PA. I am skeptical by nature, and only gravitate to this board in the spirit of being creeped out / spooked. I don't intend to generate creepypasta or construct some elaborate scheme to horrify you all, but the anonymous nature of this board means that I can be honest and open about these experiences because I have always wanted to discuss them. At the very least, I hope that you might be entertained. I have no original pictures, but I've culled these from Google Street View and other sources. Canterbury Place was originally an Episcopalian orphanage. There was a fire that burned down part of the building. I know this story would be more interesting if children died, but there were no casualties. The building was renovated and became a convalescent home for nuns. Eventually, a large company purchased the property and expanded the building both outward and upward. The original building, however, is intact. Here is a link mentioning the orphans. I worked the evening shift and often pulled doubles and stayed overnight. There was a lot of speculation about the place being haunted, but I was dismissive. The residents would frequently call and complain that there were children running up and down the halls, and could we hush them. A lady called in the middle of the night and said that a little girl entered her room and sat in her chair. She tried to offer her cookies, but she did not respond. The girl left before I made it to the room. A usually lucid and polite older gentleman would set out snacks and a drink for Aggie, a woman who sat in his recliner and sometimes refused to leave when he was ready for bed. I occasionally had to kick this imaginary Aggie out of the room so that he could sleep. That being said, I dismissed this as old people being old and demented. One night, I was doing rounds. It was either 1 or 4 a.m., can't remember which, but we go every 2 hours. We peek in the residents' rooms and make sure they are not dead or on the floor. I arrived at the room of a sweet, 90-year-old woman I particularly liked. When I opened the door, there was a young woman sitting on her sofa. She had dark hair and a pale face, but otherwise, there was nothing unusual about her. When I walked in, she looked up, and we just stared at each other. I know I should say that the room turned cold or fear struck my heart, or nope.jpg, but it wasn't like that. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and shut the door. I stood in the hall, wondering. I knew this woman's family, and did not recognize the lady in the chair. Besides, why would anyone be here in the middle of the night? I opened the door again, and the woman was gone. My resident was sleeping peacefully in bed. I checked the bathroom. It was empty. The woman was gone. I very calmly shut the door, turned around, and went back to the nurse's station without finishing my rounds. I have more information typed up, but I don't want to clog the board with uninteresting material. If Anons would like me to continue, I would be happy to. Thank you. As previously stated, I'd often wanted to discuss these incidents, but don't want to sound crazy, superstitious, or stupid. I did not even tell my coworkers about the previous incident. My second story involves a resident whose name, for the sake of the story, shall be Frank. He was a very kind-natured older gentleman, a World War II veteran with a streak of dementia, but usually quite lucid, and always telling stories. He was popular with the staff and other residents. We were all dismayed to watch him grow ill and slowly become bedridden. One evening, I arrived at work and was surprised to find Frank in the nursing office, in his wheelchair, wrapped in a blanket. Day shift pulled us aside and told a fairly remarkable story. A woman down the hall was dying. Hospice nurses had taken over. The family was there. Everyone was just sort of waiting for the moment. She finally passed in the morning, and as the body was being cleaned and prepared for transport, there was a call from Frank. They entered the room and he was screaming, "They're coming for me. They are coming for me." Everybody said, "Who? Who is coming for you?" And he said, "The man in the black suit." He came down the hall and stood at my door. Then he looked at a room down the hall. He was going to take some Italian guy. His name started with an O, but then he took a lady instead, and he is coming back from me. Frank was so distraught that he actually vaulted into his wheelchair and refused to go back to the room. He stayed in the nursing station all night and was inconsolable. When he finally fell asleep, we put him to bed. There was an Italian resident whose name started with O, by the way. He lived next to the room where the woman died. This was not the first time Frank had said strange things about death. At one point, he was very out of it, mumbling incoherently, sweating and hot. We thought he might pass at any moment, until one day, when I came in to check on him and found that he was sitting up in bed, completely healthy. I said, "Frank, how are you doing?" He said, "Oh, didn't you hear the good news? I was supposed to die last night, but then some other guy died instead, so now I feel better. I sure feel bad for that other guy." I often thought Frank had some sort of clairvoyance. It sure was. The worst story, and perhaps the most alarming, has nothing to do with me. It's second-hand, but it has been retold several times over. I will do my best, X. We have a parking garage attached to the building by elevator, and as Pittsburgh is brutally cold, it's a popular place to sneak out for smoke breaks, but only at night, when admin has already left. When I first started, one of the porters was a very large and intimidating, but actually rather polite, black gentleman, whose name, for the sake of the story, shall be John. The facility is connected by locked hallway to a government-funded apartment complex called Lambeth, and occasionally, creepy people would slip over into Canterbury. When that happened, John was usually the tough guy who threw them out. At the time, we had a 24-hour receptionist to work the phones. Our front door was locked. One night, the receptionist was doing lazy receptionist things when she heard a pounding at the door. It was John, and he was screaming. She let him in, and he ran past her, slammed the door, and sat on a bench, panting heavily. He said that he was in the garage smoking, and saw something that scared him so terribly that he ran out of the parking garage, up the street, and to the front door. Eventually, after some time had passed, John told several co-workers that, while smoking in the garage, he noticed a figure in the distance on the ramp. He took a few steps closer, thinking it was an escaped resident, but then froze in his tracks. It was a woman, wearing a very long, formal gown and facing away from him. She started to turn, very slowly, to face him, and as she was turning, he was struck with this deep and overwhelming sense of fear that literally sent him running off into the night. He never saw her face. I should have brought it up, but apparently he did not like to talk about it. Because people took an interest in Frank, I would like to mention another incident involving a resident contacting, for lack of a non-stereotypical phrase, the other side. We had a very independent and lucid resident living on the 4th floor. She was very articulate and did everything for herself. I was rather fond of her. One night, during rounds, I entered her room to find that she was talking, presumably in her sleep. Anyone who does geriatric work knows that this is not unusual, though I found it odd for the woman in question. I decided to leave her alone and continue on my way. She did not seem to be having a nightmare or in any sort of distress. I stopped by her room during my final rounds. It was early morning. She was watching television and seemed rather cheerful. Out of curiosity, I asked her, "How did you sleep last night?" And she said, "Well, I did not get much sleep, actually, because my sister came to visit." "Don't you think it's unusual that your sister came to visit in the night?" She smiled. "Well, no, because she's dead." The resident claims that she woke during the night to find her deceased sister sitting in her easy chair. They talked about old times. The resident said that her sister looked cold and she tried to offer her a blanket, but she declined. Frank was also a World War II vet, more specifically, a tank gunner. He said his ring finger was shot off by a sniper, apparently, but kept shooting regardless. He did not even realize his fingertip was gone until his friends pointed out that he was covered in blood. I suppose it was the rush of the moment. He would slip into these trances and start talking in the moment. I remember him frequently saying, "Psh, I ain't like Johnny. I ain't no goddamn coward." Don't mean to hijack your Friday pay, but I also worked in a nursing home. It was during high school, and I was only a dietary aide, but my mother was the head nurse there, so I spent a lot of my free time volunteering there, talking to residents, and just getting to know them. I only have one particularly scary story to tell though. We had a resident, I will call him Pete, who was very demented. He was a World War II vet who would occasionally flash back to the war, but in very calm ways. He would sit there, describing what he imagined was happening, as if it were a book written in present tense. He was not lucid often, but when he was, he refused to talk about the war. Once, while telling one of his flashback-ass stories, another resident had a heart attack and died less than a foot away from Pete. We began to notice that, every time he told a story, about one every 2 weeks, a resident would die very quickly, always that same day. His final story was about him watching his higher-up, general, lieutenant, I don't know the military, die. The last line of his story was, he was born to die. Pete died in his sleep that night. Your Pete reminds me of a very old Italian woman who was very Catholic and had OCD-like prayer routines that seemed almost a cult. She also had a knack for predicting who would die next. She would shake her head and say, "Oh, that poor thing." This next series of incidents is not paranormal, but it is rather creepy. After some time, I was trained to work the receptionist job at the front desk. They needed nursing assistants to cover the lunches, and I also picked up shifts on occasion. One of my functions was switchboard operating. A resident called the front desk one evening, sobbing hysterically, because a man had called her room and whispered that her house had burned down to the ground. When she asked if her husband made it out, the voice said no, he is dead, and soon, you will be dead as well. I was very disturbed by this, and told the director. She said, "Oh, that's just the obscene caller." Apparently, this man had been calling Canterbury for years. He seems to know many details about the residents, so we suspect he's either a current or former employee, a Lambeth resident, or someone with a shortwave radio who can overhear our walkie-talkies. He would often dial extensions straight to the residents' rooms, but occasionally he called the front desk. He has a very smooth, almost radio-quality voice, and he is surprisingly articulate. Every time I've answered his call, and it's something that's happened maybe 5 or 6 times, he says, "Shh, don't hang up. I want you to hear something. Do you want to hear something? I want to come for you." Huh? I always hung up, except for one time, when I said, "Hey, just out of curiosity, why do you do this?" That time, he hung up on me. Apparently, he uses this strategy on old ladies as well. As far as we know, he only calls the women. Sometimes, he whispers horrible things or threatens them. We had a resident, let's say Carla, who was very young to be in an assisted living facility, 50 years old or so, but stayed with us because of disability. She was reasonably attractive for her age. The obscene caller began to ring her extension with some frequency, perhaps because of her noticeably younger voice. She started receiving letters in the mail. I only saw one of them. There was a total of 3, which she decided to keep for evidence. It was an envelope with her full name, containing hair clippings and a wrinkled piece of paper saying, "Hi Carla." The paper had a visible stain that was probably ejaculate. The first letter apparently had a photo of her exiting our handicap van in our wheelchair, but she threw it away because she thought her teenage grandson was just pranking her. They may in hospital due to surgery. In prep now, half asleep. They're telling me all of the boring details. We will start cutting here, etc. In there now. #sleep now. Right before I pass out, see a doctor in black scrubs, face mask, and glasses. Wake up 8 hours later for a 3-hour surgery. Notice more stitches than they told me. Scream bloody murder. Nurse books it into the room. Just in a panic, screaming, crying, the whole 9 yards. Fall asleep without knowing. Wake up another 8 hours later. There is 2 doctors, 3 nurses, and a cop. No fucking clue what's going on. My main doctor says, "No need to panic. You are in your bed. Just had stuff, etc." Turns out, I died twice on the table. Somehow, they nicked my heart once. I almost bled out. Pretty sure I saw death before they put me under. Went in for stomach surgery. Almost died. P.S. Sorry for spelling. You fucking should be sorry, those sentences were fucking horribly written. Recently moved. New school. Made some new friends. Hanging out during lunchtime. Friend runs up. "Guys, the Dildo Banditos have struck again." The what? Everybody gets up and runs to a locker that has a dildo superglued to it. It's mine. I wonder whose that locker is. Poor guy. I hope he has some good friends. I explain it's my locker. They start treating me like I'm about to die. New friends avoid me for the entire rest of the day. So confused. Walking home from school. Get jumped by 3 kids wearing masks and sombreros. They beat the shit out of me with dildos. To this day, I am still really confused and disturbed by the whole event. There is a disappearing house in Thompson, Iowa. I saw it back in 2006. In town for a few months, working. Long hours. Up before dawn. Normally don't get back to my motel until near sundown. Spend my days off sleeping or watching TV. Point is, I didn't really get a chance to see much of the area at all. So on a day off, I decided to take a drive. Cornfields everywhere. I pass one house that really stands out. Big and white, kind of Victorian looking, with a big wraparound porch. Looks brand new. Confused. I pass this area every day on my way to work, and I have never seen it before. Figure it's because I'm usually still waking up when I'm heading to work. There is an old lady outside at the mailbox. I wave to her. She just stares me down the whole time. Whatever. Anyway, fast forward. I'm heading back to the motel after driving around for a few hours, expecting to see the big white house again. I don't. Whole area is a cornfield. Never saw the house again. I remember this was off the 84, right at the border of Iowa and Illinois. Anybody from there ever heard of this? I'm not from there, and have not been back since. Not supernatural, but still. I was 18, living on my own. Bad neighborhood. Smoking cigarette from my window on the 4th floor, about 2 a.m. I hear a girl crying and being dragged by her hand by a man. She is about 8 years old. She keeps yelling, "Dad, Dad." It doesn't faze me. Neighborhood was bad. Plenty of people abused their kids. The guy keeps pulling on her arm to follow him. He is audibly very angry, yelling back at the girl to shut up. They enter an apartment building, almost parallel to mine. As soon as they enter the building, the girl starts screaming very loudly. I still don't think anything of it. 2 days later, I come home and police are everywhere. Turns out, the man was not her father. He assaulted and killed her. The landlord got bothered by the smell and walked into her dismembered body. Not my story. Something a Native American guy posted a while ago, but it's some of the creepiest shit I've ever heard. My dad picks me up from school in his pickup truck after he got off work one winter's night. We were driving on a long stretch of road that just goes through the woods. It's pitch black outside. The truck radio did not work, so I was just sitting, staring straight out at the road, getting hypnotized by the passing trees. Suddenly, started to get an intense sensation that something is watching me through the window to my right. I started to turn my head to see what it is when my dad yells, "Don't look." Immediately start to hear tapping on the window right next to my face. Heart stops. That was the only time I ever saw fear on my dad's face. He started to pray loudly in Navajo. Stare straight ahead, heart pounding, not daring to look out the window. Suddenly, the truck dips as a weight falls into the bed. Whatever the fuck this thing is in the back, right behind my head. Start to hear tapping on the window behind me. My father makes me look at him as he continues to pray. Close my eyes tight and wish for it to be over. After a few endless minutes, the truck dips again and the tapping stops. My father says, "Tomorrow, we will ask your grandfather to say a prayer so that the evil will forget our faces." English to Navajo equivalent. Drive home and lie awake in bed all night. Father and I never talk about that time ever again.